Hi, my name is Erica Avila, and I am a specialist in environmental health with the Arkansas Department of Health. I appreciate you all inviting me out to Phillips County today to talk to you about mercury exposure and whether or not there is cause for concern in this area. We're going to talk about a couple of different things today, including different forms of mercury and the mercury cycle, environmental mercury and bioaccumulation and biomagnification, indoor sources of mercury, signs and symptoms of mercury poisoning and the treatment for it, different factors that will influence the severity of health effects on an individual person, and whether or not there is cause for concern in Phillips County. This will include what levels are considered safe, current levels in this area, and ongoing monitoring that the state and federal government is doing to ensure long-term safety for you and your families. The three most common forms of mercury that you might be exposed to on a day-to-day basis are methylmercury in things like fish and shellfish, elemental mercury, which you might find in things like dental fillings, thermometers, or when you burn fossil fuels, and then inorganic mercury, which are your mercury salts. A couple of important things to note are methylmercury is the most toxic form, and it's almost always 100% absorbed when you're exposed to it, either when you swallow it or if you inhale it. It's also important to note that both methylmercury and elemental mercury can cross the blood-brain barrier. It crosses the placenta, which puts pregnant women and unborn babies at higher risk than the rest of the general population. And these two forms of mercury also accumulate in both the brain and the kidney, which is important when you're thinking about bioaccumulation and biomagnification, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and how we get exposed to mercury through the food chain, which we'll also discuss in just a moment. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the mercury cycle. Mercury is introduced into the food supply in a variety of ways, mainly as runoff pollution from pesticides and from factories and things like industrial mining and burning fossil fuels, where it's released into the atmosphere and eventually settles into the waterways. Once it's in the water, it's then converted into methylmercury by bacteria and subsequently contaminates aquatic species such as fish and shellfish, which we then catch and eat. A couple of sources of environmental mercury exposure we've already discussed. This is through consuming things like fish and shellfish, where methylmercury has accumulated in the muscle tissue of these organisms. Higher concentrations are found in larger fish due to bioaccumulation and biomagnification that we'll discuss next. And if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see organisms like swordfish, shark, and smallmouth bass have higher concentrations of mercury, and they're higher up in their respective food chains. Other sources of environmental mercury exposure include water and soil, and contamination of water and soil is a result of both natural processes like rock weathering and volcanic activity, and human processes like mining, industrial runoff, or burning waste and fossil fuels. So bioaccumulation occurs within an individual organism over time. It's when a single organism contains higher concentrations of mercury than the environmental surroundings, and this process occurs as mercury accumulates and is not excreted. Biomagnification occurs when mercury concentrations increase as you move from one level to the next up the food chain. This happens as larger organisms consume smaller ones, and this is why fish like swordfish and shark have higher mercury concentrations than smaller fish or aquatic organisms like shrimp, for instance. Some indoor sources of mercury exposure include things like breathing mercury vapors from open containers or broken devices like mercury-containing thermometers, batteries, light bulbs, or electrical switches. This can also occur as an occupational hazard if you work in fields like industrial processing or mining. Historically, you could also be exposed to mercury through the use of dental amalgams or silver fillings, if you have ever had a cap put on your teeth. These are typically composed of about 40 to 50% mercury, and use is declining due to availability of better alternative materials and improvements in oral health and the awareness of the importance of dental hygiene and brushing your teeth every day. One other source of indoor mercury exposure that I'd like to talk about briefly is the use of thimerosal in vaccines and pharmaceuticals. Thimerosal is ethyl mercury, which we have not discussed previously, but it's important to note that ethyl mercury is completely broken down by the body, it does not accumulate, and it's non-toxic. A multitude of peer-reviewed studies have determined thimerosal to be completely safe for both adults and children time and time again over the past 40 to 50 years. In spite of this, use is still declining, and now all vaccines are available in a thimerosal-free formulation to kind of put a halt on the anti-vax movement that I'm sure that we're all aware of. Now we're going to talk about some symptoms of mercury poisoning. Mercury poisoning is a disease of accumulation. Toxicity is slow to develop and progressive. As we've already discussed, methyl mercury and elemental mercury can both cross the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier, which puts pregnant women and unborn babies at higher risk because elemental mercury can affect the function and development of every major body system, including the nervous system, digestive system, kidneys, respiratory and cardiovascular systems, among others. Health risks from exposure depend on several factors, including age, the type of mercury they were exposed to, dose, duration of exposure, and the type of contact. The target organ for inhaled mercury vapor is primarily the brain. Mercury salts chiefly damage the gut lining and the kidney, but they are excreted, while methyl mercury is widely distributed throughout the body and it's incredibly toxic. Long-term exposure affects the central nervous system development, especially in fetuses and children, but it can affect any age. If you think about the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, he went crazy from exposure to mercury. Early signs of mercury poisoning include insomnia, forgetfulness, loss of appetite, and mild tremor. In children, exposure can result in decreased IQ, delayed walking or talking, lack of coordination, or mental retardation. Long-term and high doses can also cause blindness, memory loss, seizures, and the inability to speak. Adults exposed to too much methyl mercury may begin experiencing things like trembling hands and numbness or tingling of their lips, tongue, fingers, or toes. And these symptoms can start to show up long after the mercury exposure. Higher doses can have effects on things like walking, vision, speech, loss of taste, and loss of hearing, and high doses of inhaled mercury can lead to respiratory failure. So once we know someone has been exposed to mercury, how are we going to treat them? The first thing that we're going to do is remove the source. We have to decontaminate the area or the person. That means washing your hands thoroughly, showering, or if there's been a spill, cleaning up the spill with proper materials and making sure that it's cleaned thoroughly. If we know that somebody has had high-dose mercury exposure, we're going to have to admit them to the hospital. They're going to have supportive oxygen to prevent respiratory failure, and they have to have IV access to give them chelation therapy, which is a treatment used to remove heavy metals, including mercury, from the blood. They'll inject a specific agent, such as, for instance, EDTA, which is ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid. This is a synthetic amino acid, and it binds to the metal and allows it to be excreted in the urine. We've already touched on this briefly, but I'd like to discuss it again. Some people are more sensitive to mercury poisoning than others. Highest risk populations include pregnant women and women who may become pregnant soon or unborn babies because methyl mercury and elemental mercury are both known to cause birth defects, and young children who are still developing, as different forms of mercury can cause developmental delays. And then also populations that rely on fish for a large portion of their diet because they're going to have more exposure than the rest of the general population. So what levels are considered safe? We're going to talk about intake and federal environmental limits. The World Health Organization says that we should limit weekly intake to less than 1.6 microgram per kilogram of body weight. The EPA says that we should limit daily intake to less than 0.1 micrograms per kilogram of body weight, with a total daily limit of 15 micrograms, according to the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. Federal environmental limits say that drinking water should have less than 2 parts per billion of mercury. Fish and shellfish should have less than 1 part per million of methyl mercury, and I want you to keep that in mind as we move on to the next slide, which talks about the current levels in Phillips County. And then OSHA has specific workplace limits if you work in things. So what are the levels here in Phillips County? You see your county over to the right in red, and it's circled, and the soil levels here are less than 0.047 parts per million. This is well under the 1 part per million safety range, and it's well within naturally occurring levels, which is 0.02 to 0.625 parts per million. It's on the low end of that. And of the fish tissue in this area sampled, we took tissue from multiple species, and it ranged from 0.13 to 0.49 parts per million, which is also well below the 1 part per million level that is considered to be safe. So as of right now in this area, residents of Phillips County don't have anything to be worried about unless you are consuming fish on a day-to-day basis, in which case you may want to go get your blood tested. So what is the state and federal government doing to keep your family safe? They do ongoing monitoring of mercury contamination in fish studies. That's how we know what the mercury levels are for the fish in this area. And then they do human biological monitoring for populations that consume large quantities of fish on a day-to-day basis. They also have several enforceable regulations, including the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard Act, which reduces the amount of toxic air pollutants that are allowed to be released into the atmosphere. And then they have the 1992 Amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, which limits the maximum mercury level for public water sources to 2 parts per billion, as we've already discussed. Then they have several rules and regulations regarding what is allowed to be admitted into the atmosphere from burning, like waste combustors, public sewage, and medical waste. And these are the references for the information that I have provided for you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.